word on this. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Murray Amateur Radio Club. We had a little bit of a digression at the beginning of the meeting. That's perfectly fine. I will not make that a habit, but I enjoyed it. And any of you who the comment about Mel the cook on Alice went over your head, you know, that just shows your lack of age, and maybe your what's the opposite of lack of maturity? No. Anyway, so we're going to talk tonight about packet radio, but before we get started, anything of interest to the membership? Gordon, do you have anything?
I don't think so, other than the potluck next week.
We're going to do the potluck next week. I've sent out a sign-up sheet to the MARC members mailing list. If you're not on MARC members, why not?
No, I don't.
You didn't get it?
Nope, I got it.
You should have gotten it.
I'm looking at my new email. You know, just come out and tell me.
Is it in your spam folder by chance?
No,
like all the rest of my mail?
No, it goes straight to the trash.
Okay. It was definitely sent to the MARC members mailing list. I'll put a thing up on the website as well about that, just so that anybody can hop on there as well. So
We know where we're gonna have that.
we're gonna have it here. I talked to Joey about it. He said he would rather us do it right here because we're already on the list for here. So then he doesn't have to mess around with telling anybody else that we're gonna be anywhere else. So we'll do it here, and it'll be next week in lieu of our regular meeting. I think Sherwood and Brad have already signed up to bring something. So anybody else who's interested, feel free to bring what you like. I don't know yet what we're gonna have entirely there, so I might try to put together an entree, or I may just go out and buy something. I don't know. We'll see.
I can
Well,
make turkey if you want.
You want to make a turkey for it? What a guy. You mean your
That is if I get my.
Jill can make a turkey, is what you're saying, right? So
No turkey.
okay, well, it was sent, so everybody should have it if you're on the MARC members list. I'll probably send it to the announced list as well, just for completeness, but I think everybody that's on.
Can you tell me when you sent it? What day was the date?
It was earlier today, yeah.
This morning?
Yeah.
I'll forward it to you then. Thanks.
By
Well, that just goes to show somebody likes, actually, I don't know if that is even true. Somebody will send it.
somebody likes turkey, let's put it that way.
Somebody likes turkey.
I sent it 8 hours ago, according to this. So yeah, it should have been there. I
Let me
didn't
check my spam.
I didn't get any bounces. But okay. So tonight we're going to talk about packet radio. I know we've talked about packet radio before. It was in the throes of COVID back in 2020. We were doing everything on Zoom, and I don't think we recorded it at that time, but the slides are on the website. So if anybody wants to go review that earlier presentation, the slides are there on the website. But what is packet radio again? Packet radio is a way of sending or using network protocols over radio frequencies. So information is encapsulated into discrete packets, hence the name packet radio. And the packets are encoded into an audio form. Wow. Okay, I gotta fix that. That was something. I don't know what it was exactly. Let's see. There should be a way to like turn all of this off. Where is that? Maybe it's focus mode. Here we go. Do not disturb. Let's try that. Let's see if that does a trick. Okay. So the packets are encoded into an audio form. If you guys some of us probably remember using modems to dial up to things like bulletin boards and AOL and the internet and things like that. And remember how you would, okay, I'm gonna really date myself here. You would dial the phone and then you would hear this beep and then you would put it in the little acoustic coupler and the lights would flash and then on your terminal or your computer, it would start printing really slowly as it was receiving the information. And then you would log in and whatnot. So this is a similar kind of thing. We use the same kind of signaling that was used for modems. But the data is transmitted over the air on a given frequency, and other stations can receive that data and do something with it. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about how networks work first. We're all familiar with using the internet, I hope, most of us, except maybe Dan, whose email doesn't seem to work. But yeah, the internet and all networking essentially is based on this, what we call the 7-layer OSI model. OSI is the Open Systems Interconnection model, and this is an actual published standard. The internet protocols actually kind of break this down to a 4-layer stack by combining some of the layers into the same layer, but we don't need to worry about that right now. But essentially, there's this stack of layers, right? Starting at the physical layer, which is the lowest layer of the stack. And that's like, if you're working with Ethernet, that's the wire, right? That's like the lowest level you can get. It's the physical media. Then the data link layer is a way of putting data onto that wire or putting data onto that physical layer. And then the packet layer is a layer above that, the data link layer, the network layer is a way of putting like addressing information on that data that's going out on the wire, okay? And then above that, you have the transport layer, which is where you actually define things like getting information from one machine to another machine or one node to another node. We use the term nodes in networking. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But that everything from that transport layer on down is kind of the guts of the network and how it actually gets things from one place to another. Now, you'll hear people talk about, well, this is a layer 3 device, or this is a layer 4 device, or so on, right? And what they're talking about is where they land on this stack. So layer 4 is this transport layer. Layer 5 is the session layer, and this is where we start getting into the applications themselves. So the session lets you do things like, okay, I've got a connection to host X. Now I'm going to create a session that is a thing between me and host X. And then the presentation layer is how I take things from my application, put them into this presentation layer, and they come out in the presentation layer on the other end. And as far as I'm concerned as an application developer, I don't care how that happens. Anything below that presentation layer, I couldn't care less about because I'm the application. I only care about the presentation. But all that guts that happens underneath is all the things like switches, routers, repeaters, anything like that that is used to actually make the data go from one place to another. Okay. So as we look through this stack, we see that the higher layers are more complex or more abstracted from the physical layer, and the physical layer is kind of the basis, the basic layer. That's where, things of a physical nature actually happen. So in the internet model, we have this kind of 4-layer stack, right? We call it the data link layer, which incorporates the hardware layer, the physical layer. We have the networking layer, we have the transport layer, and then the application. So if you think about this in terms of the internet protocols, the data link layer is things like Ethernet, the physical network cables. Maybe your Wi-Fi, I guess that didn't work. Maybe your Wi-Fi, right? Gracious. Okay, this is what we're gonna do.
If you knew anything about Ethernet,
Yeah, I just fixed it. And in fact, I'm gonna fix it some more here, because I'm gonna make sure this doesn't beep at me either. That's right. Got to keep fixing it until it stops being unfixed. Okay, so that Ethernet layer is kind of this physical layer and data link layer put together. And then ARP is a protocol that lives at that layer. And what it does is it allows the physical network device to know who it's talking to and decide who it wants to send data to. So every device has, you've probably heard of these MAC addresses. You guys have heard of a MAC address before? It's a 6-byte number that's defined by the hardware itself. And so every device that works on Ethernet is going to have a MAC address. And if you've got two devices on the same physical network, you can construct a packet on that network that has a source MAC address and a destination MAC address, right? And this is how it's happening down at the lowest level. You don't ever really think about this. You may think about it in terms of, oh, on my Wi-Fi router at home, I can turn on MAC filtering and only allow specific MAC addresses to access my device, right? And that's something that you can do. That's happening at that data link layer, right? Just above that physical layer, that data link layer. Above that, you have the networking protocols. And in the internet, those protocols are IP, which is the internet protocol. And another one that's there is ICMP. There are a couple of other ones that are in use at that level as well, but these are the ones that we really use on the internet. Now, you've all heard of something like an IP address, right? And there's two versions of IP that are in common use right now. There's IPv4 and IPv6. In IPv4, an IP address is 4 bytes. So there's only 4 billion of them in the whole world. In IPv6, it is 64 bytes. It's like a lot, right? You could actually give every grain of sand an IP address with IPv6 and still have IP addresses available. So this is why we want to move to IPv6. If you've ever heard your network provider say, oh, we're going to do IPv6 now, that's because we've run out of IPv4 addresses. They're all allocated. So if you need one, you have to get one from somebody who already has one, right? There's other things like how the networks are structured and how those IP addresses are arranged and things like that that all go into play there. But basically, to think about an IP address, it's going to be globally unique. Okay, so if I've got an IP address 1.2.3.4 and I want to send a packet of information to IP address 5.6.7.8, all I have to do at this network layer is say, I want to go to 5.6.7.8, and the underlying layers take care of all the magic on how it actually gets there. And it just pops out at the other end. And same thing going the other way, right? If he wants to send a packet back to 1.2.3.4, he puts that in as the destination and off it goes. On top of this networking layer is what we call the transport layer. And there's a couple of protocols that are mainly used there, TCP and UDP. And you'll often hear people say, well, it's TCP IP. And they mean like TCP/IP. And they're talking about TCP, which is Transmission Control Protocol, over IP, which is Internet Protocol. There's also UDP, which is the Universal Datagram Protocol, okay? The difference here is at that network layer, if I stuff a packet in there with an IP address on it, I don't know if it's actually going to make it to the destination or not. It might get there, it might not. The only way I know is if that guy says, yes, I got it, or I never heard from you, right? These transport layers put another layer on top of that. So TCP actually is a connection-oriented protocol. And what it does is it basically guarantees if you set up a TCP connection, anything you put in is going to come out at the other end in the right order, and it's all going to be there, or you're going to know that it didn't make it, and that connection is going to be lost or dropped. UDP, on the other hand, is kind of like the IP layer. You can stuff stuff into UDP. It might get there, it might not. You don't know.
Best effort.
It's a best effort. It's probably going to get there. In our networks that we have today, our networks are really robust. It's probably going to get there, right? But there's no guarantees. Some protocols are written on top of UDP, other protocols are written on top of TCP, and that's when we get to this application layer. And that's where you have things like HTTP, which is the World Wide Web thing, right? FTP, which is a file transfer protocol. They list POP3 here. I don't think anybody uses POP anymore. POP was the post office protocol, and it was a protocol used to go pick up your email from a post office, a server. SMTP is the simple mail transfer protocol, and it's what's used between machines on the internet to send email back and forth, right? And then SNMP that they detail here is the simple network management protocol, which personally, I think that's a misnomer because it's not very simple. But the reason it was called the simple network management protocol is because it's simple to implement it on low-level hardware. So if you've got a managed switch, for example, you manage it via this SNMP protocol. And SNMP is built on top of UDP, whereas these other ones that we talked about there are built on top of TCP. There's also protocols like the DNS protocol, which is the name resolution protocol, and things like that. Those are all protocols that operate at that application layer. So they don't care about the nuts and bolts down at the wire. They only care about, hey, I've got a connection, I shovel my data into it, I know it's going to come out at the other end, or vice versa. Okay, so I think I basically talked about this entire slide. All right. So I thought we were talking about amateur radio, not networking. Well, what's amateur radio for? Don't everyone talk at once. Ha, ha, ha. It's for communications, right? We have amateur radio because we want to communicate with people. Normally, when we do this, we do it by talking or by sending CW or by sending digital information. There's not only one way to communicate. There's lots of different ways to communicate. If there was only one way, we'd all be doing amateur radio with CW on a straight key. Okay. We know that that's not the case. We have phone, we have digital modes, we have slow scan TV, we have all kinds of stuff, right? There's tons of different protocols out there that can be used, or different modes that we use in amateur radio. So what's packet radio again? It's running a network on a radio frequency physical layer. Okay. So it's another communications mechanism that we can utilize in amateur radio. With amateur radio, difference between amateur radio or this packet radio mechanism and say the Ethernet and things like that we use in our day-to-day internet access, the big differences are down at that physical and data link layer, way down there at the bottom, right? The physical medium is the big difference, sort of. So in amateur radio, we're going to use RF as the physical layer. Ethernet is actually based on RF. It's actually a radio protocol. So if you think about, how many guys have ever seen like thin cable Ethernet? Dan nods his head slowly. Like coaxial cable, or what they used to call thick Ethernet, which is about, what do you say, about almost an inch in diameter. It's probably 3/4 of an inch in diameter.
It's at least 3/4.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
And this is what they used to use before we had Ethernet running on twisted pair cable. They used to use a long piece of physical cable, and you would attach Ethernet transceivers to that cable. And the properties of Ethernet were based on the physical properties of that cable and how the radio waves moved on that cable. Think of it like you've got an antenna, or you've got the feed line, but you don't have any antenna on it. It's just terminated with 50 ohm terminators at either end. So some of the things that happen on that is what happens if two people try to transmit at the same time? You have a collision. And Ethernet uses a mechanism called CDMA, carrier detect multiple access, right? And so basically, when your machine wants to talk on an Ethernet, it listens first That's the carrier detect part. Is anybody else talking? If I didn't hear anybody else talking, then I'm going to assert my carrier. So now I'm going to start talking. Then I'm going to wait a second or two because I want to make sure that anybody else on the wire hears my signal come up and they don't try to start talking. Bye, Brad. They don't try to start talking because I'm going to use the cable, right? Only one station can use the cable at a time. How many stations can use the repeater at a time, Sherwood? When you're on your RAN radio?
A lot of people could.
How many can talk at one time on the repeater at the same moment?
Well, just one that you're gonna hear,
Right.
but you always hear that they're saying, okay, you doubled up, tripled up.
Same thing. That's exactly the same thing that would happen on Ethernet. If two machines tried to transmit at the same time, they would double with each other or have a collision event, and they could detect that and know, oh, nobody heard my message. So they would back off and try again a little bit later. So Ethernet uses radio just like we use radio, okay? Except they do it on a piece of wire rather than through the air like we're going to do. Okay. So what's this physical layer look like? Well, in packet radio, sorry for the blurriness of this. I didn't realize it was going to be that blurry. This is pretty terrible. A packet radio station basically has three parts. You have a computer or a terminal. Who knows what a terminal is? A couple people. A terminal is basically, we used to call it a glass TTY, right? It's basically like a TV monitor and a keyboard, but there's no intelligence in there. It doesn't do anything by itself. It's got a serial port on the back and you use it to connect to some other machine that's actually going to do the work. So you can use a terminal for packet radio or a computer. The computer acts as the terminal. You run terminal software on the computer. That's connected to a device called a TNC, and you can't really see it on here, but they show here transmit going into the TNC and receive coming out. And then I think that's supposed to be the ground for these two signals. And then between the TNC and the radio, you've got a push to talk signal, you've got a mic audio, you've got a ground, and you've got speaker audio coming back to the TNC, and then the radio is connected to an antenna. I'm going to get off of that, but so the physical link, the associated hardware, you got to have a radio. Typically, when we're talking packet radio, we're talking UHF, VHF, but there are mechanisms for doing packet radio over HF. You got to have a TNC. Think of that as a modem and an interface. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. And you need a computer or a terminal. Now, most people probably don't have a terminal anymore. I've got an old Wise 50 terminal sitting in the back seat of one of my cars, but you know, that's another presentation, right? But yeah, so those are the three things that you need. So what's a TNC? We know what a computer is. We know what a radio is. We're going to talk about what a TNC is. TNC is called a terminal node controller. Okay, it actually has a couple of different functions. So it acts as a modem. So it's converting a digital signal into an audio signal, just like that old acoustic modem that you would plug the handset into, or if you had a modem that connected directly to the phone line and somebody would pick up the phone, you'd hear going on in the background. That's the same kind of thing, right? It also acts as a node and potentially as a digipeater. So there's a couple of more concepts that we're going to talk about, nodes and digipeaters. What's a node? So think about a node in packet radio as a station. So if I'm going to set up a packet radio node, that's going to be my station. I'm going to have my computer, my TNC, and my radio. That's my node, okay? A node can be an endpoint for communications. A node can also be an intermediate point within the network. So a node can act as a router, or it can act as a repeater. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Wait, we got a network now? Yeah, we do, actually. We could have a network. This is a packet radio network. We've got, and I tell you, some of these things are from the 70s, right? When packet radio was first conceived, in like 1978. Okay. And it became legal in the US in like 1980. So that's what, 42 years ago? So when they show a computer on here and it's got a freaking 9-track tape drive on it, that's why. Because some of these pictures are from 42 years ago. So what we've got here, we've got a couple of different things. We've got our RF cloud happening here. And you've got these little antennas on our little machines here. We've got the little circles. These are going to be our TNCs, or maybe those are our radios. I think they're the radio and the TNC together. And then you've got maybe a computer attached to it. You maybe have a terminal attached to it. This guy actually has 2 terminals attached to a single network interface unit. You might have a gateway attached to it, which is kind of like a router that allows you to bridge this network onto a local area network where you've got more than one computer. You might have a gateway and some kind of other network that machines are attached to. And you might have a gateway that attaches you to, and this dates it as well, the ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. And so you might have machines attached to that network. So all of these things are together and they're all kind of talking to each other, right? This is a packet radio network. So let's talk about it. Why do we need a network? Well, what happens if I've got a node and Dave's got a node, but where his node is and where my node is, they can't actually talk to each other directly. And this is where networking comes into play, okay? Let's say I've got a node, Dave's got a node, Gordon's got a node, Dan's got a node. Gordon's node can talk to Dan's and mine can talk to Gordon's. Dan's can talk to Dave's. So if I want to talk to Dave, I can go to Gordon, to Dan, to Dave. So in this example here, we've got these interconnects, these links between machines, right? So A up here, he can see B, C, and D. He can't see E, F, G, or any of these other guys directly. But C can see F, and G can see L, and E can see J and B, and so on. So if I'm sitting here at A and I want to get a message to N, I can send it to C, to F, to I, to K, to N, or I can send it to D, to G, to L, to N. Or I can send it to B, to E, to J, to M, to K, to N, and still get it there. This is what the network is doing for you. Now, when the internet was being developed, the ARPANET and the IP protocols, one of the reasons that it was originally created, it was a defense project. It was put together by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA. And that's why we call it, or called it, the ARPANET, the Advanced Research Project Agency Network. And what the whole reasoning was, well, gee, what if there's a nuclear war and my machine in Omaha gets blown up? How do I get messages from California to Washington, D.C.? Well, so let's think about that. Let's say A is in California and N is in Washington, D.C., and F is Omaha. And Omaha gets blown up. Well, I can automatically say, if I know what this network looks like, A can automatically say, well, I can go to D and G and L and get to N, or I can go this way around if maybe L is offline for some reason. So it's kind of what they call a self-healing network. Basically, the idea being that the protocols on the network can help it to know how to get information from one place to another. They're called routing protocols, right? In amateur radio, I want to send a message to Dave, but I got to go through Gordon and Dan to get there. What if Dan's turned his radio off because he's moving it to the other side of the room or something? How do I get there? Well, maybe Gordon can talk to Sherwood and Sherwood can talk to Dave. So the network will automatically figure that out and make that routing happen so that I can get that information across.
And how does he do that?
there are underlying protocols that handle that. And we'll talk about the protocols in a little while, but I want you to be familiar with that kind of concept. Okay. So what if I don't have a TNC? Well, what you really need is some way of getting your digital data into audio form, right? Well, nowadays we have ways of doing that. You can have a sound card. If your sound card can be interfaced to a radio and you've got a computer, you can run software on your computer that pretends to be a TNC and does all the things that a TNC would do. Some examples of those are Direwolf, AGWPE, which is AGW. There's a guy, his call sign is SV2 AGW, and that's why the AGW is there. And then PE stands for packet engine. There's also one called Sound Modem. Nobody really uses that anymore. And there was one called UZ7HO that's fairly common on Windows platforms. I've run Direwolf before. I've run AGWPE before. You can basically choose what you want. Direwolf is actually open source. I built it on this machine last week just to prove that I could do it and actually run it. And it works great. But these software modems only provide the modem part of that data link layer. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. How about that physical connection to the radio? So now we got a sound card or something that's converting digital signals to audio and back. So it's a modem, modulator, demodulator. That's what modem stands for. Well, how do we hook that up to the radio? There are three main connection points that you really care about when you're connecting a sound card or a computer to a radio. You want your audio out from the computer that goes into the mic port of the radio. You want the audio into the computer that comes from the speaker on the radio, the speaker port on the radio. And you want to be able to trigger the push to talk button on the radio so the radio knows when to start transmitting, right? There's also a fourth signal that you might care about, which is the carrier detect signal. Typically, you'll see that referred to as the squelch signal on an interface. And it's basically saying the radio thinks it's hearing a signal that's worth hearing. Most of these interfaces don't care about that. They just listen all the time. And so they don't really care about that, but you could use that signal if you wanted to. So what's this physical interface look like? Well, here's a diagram of one. And this one basically shows how you would connect the computer side to the radio side. And it's using, as an example, this particular port over here, which would be on the radio side. And you've got some pins on here, the mic input, the mic ground, the speaker audio. This one's not used. This would be the speaker ground. This is the PTT ground, and this would be the radio, the PTT signal for the radio. And then on the computer side, you've got an audio connection here for the sound card line in. You've got an audio connection here for the sound card line out. And you've got a serial port here where they're actually using the ground, which is pin, was it on this? Pin 5 on this. And they're using this RTS pin 7. You might also use this DTR. RTS and DTR, RTS is ready to send, and DTR is data terminal ready. Request to send? Okay, request to send. DTR is data terminal ready. And these are basically parts of the serial protocol, the RS-232 serial protocol. A lot of hardware doesn't actually use these, but they're used in this example interface here as a way to get information out of the computer and into the radio. Basically, in this diagram, the software on the computer is going to assert this RTS signal or turn it on when it wants the radio to key up. And when it wants the radio to unkey, it'll turn that signal off. So you can see what they've got here. They've got these wired up. This is like a serial port here. Pins 2 and 3 would be used for the transmit and receive. We don't care about that because we're not actually sending data out through this. Remember, we're sending audio. And so they kind of map this through a little transistor over here. There's a little circuit here. And that ends up when this goes high, this PTT signal goes high. And when this goes low, the PTT signal goes low. Some radios are the other way around. And if that's the case, I think you have to flip that diode. And there's a couple other things that you have to put in the other direction because you want the PTT to go low when you want to transmit and go high when you want to receive. It depends on the radio. On the sound card side, you can see here, let's go to this one here, whether it's the line out from the sound card. This is where the speaker, the computer speaker sound is coming out, right? So it comes across here to a little transformer. This is a 1-to-1 transformer. And the idea here is this side is electrically isolated from this side, okay? So if something breaks and this thing starts putting 12 volts across this, you're not going to get 12 volts getting dumped into your radio. But because it's using a modulated audio signal here, that makes it through the transformer and a modulated audio signal shows up over here. And this is hooked up to the mic port on the radio. Same thing applies on the receiving side of the computer. The speaker port from the radio goes through this transformer, which is an isolator, and then into the radio, into the computer. You definitely want this isolation. It's typically done with these little transformers, and you guys have probably seen these little transformers on different pieces of equipment. You can also use an opto isolator. I've seen that used before. And in those, you've actually got a little diode, a little LED that is connected on the one side and a little photoreceptor that's on the other side. And so that signal is transmitted across a little optical connection. And that is like you can't get better isolation than that. But the little transformers work fine as long as they're not broken. The PTC signal, you can also leave that out if your radio is set up for Vox. Remember, we've used Vox, it stands for voice operated transmit. That's basically you set your radio up so that when it's receiving, when it hears any audio on the microphone, it automatically starts transmitting. And when the audio stops, it stops transmitting. Normally, we don't do that on our radios because if you're in a noisy environment, you can be transmitting when you don't intend to be. But remember, we're hooking this up to the computer, so there won't be any sound at all unless we're intentionally making sound. There's some commercially available interfaces, and we've talked about some of these before. I've actually brought in my signal link and passed it around so people have seen what that looks like. But these ones, I used to have one that actually had audio cables on one side and a radio connection on the other side. And it was a little passive box, didn't have any power in it or anything because everything was done through the signals that were coming either from the computer or from the radio. I looked around online. I don't find anybody selling those anymore.
Isn't that DigiBeacons?
No, the DigiRig has actually got a sound card built into it. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't been able to find anything like that anymore. You could still build your own if you wanted to, following that model that was in the diagram. But yeah, so these used to be fairly common. And if I could remember the name of it or which box in my garage had it in it, I would have brought it or at least had a picture of one for you. But yeah, I couldn't find any of those online anymore. What I was able to find is these interfaces that have a built-in sound card. So essentially it's a little box with a sound card in it, with all the isolation circuitry and everything else, and a connector that plugs into your radio. And so you've seen the signal link before. It basically has a USB port on the side. Most computers nowadays don't have a serial port anymore. So presenting a USB port is pretty common now. So the USB comes from the computer, plugs into this little box. Your computer says, hey, look, a new sound card. You configure your software, Direwolf or UH7ZO or whatever, UZ7HO or sound modem or whatever, to use that sound card, which is in this little box that you have on the side of the radio. And then it does all the magic. And you connect that up to your radio. Big Blaster from West Mountain Radio does that. Signal Link and DigiRig are three that are fairly commonly used. I think Signal Link is probably the most common. They run about 140 bucks, 130, 140, somewhere around there. They're not that expensive. And they have dials on the front where you can adjust the levels and things like that, which is really nice. So what about the other part of the data link layer? Remember, we talked about kind of this protocol on how we want to configure things that are going in and out, right? In protocols like Ethernet, Ethernet defines what the framing of the data looks like, what radio frequencies are used, all of that kind of stuff. In packet radio, they use a protocol called AX25. There's a protocol called X25 that was used, phone systems used to use it. I assume they still do. Although they probably all moved to what's that new one that's all packetized. I can't remember the name of it. AMP or something weird like that. I don't remember what it was called, but yeah, so there was a protocol called X25, and then AX25 is the amateur version of X25, right? So it's X25 adapted for amateur radio use. TNC implements both that physical layer and the AX25 layer. And the AX25 layer, we're going to talk more about that in a minute, but typically the software modem only implements that physical interface part, the modem part. It doesn't know beans about AX25. So we'll talk some more about that in a minute too. Typically what will come out of these devices, these software modems, is what they call KISS protocol, keep it simple, stupid, or the AGWPE protocol, which is similar but different to the KISS protocol. And the sound card modems, they do one thing, they do it well, they convert the digital info to audio and control the radio. They don't implement all the functions of a real TNC. They use this KISS protocol or this AGWPE protocol, and they present that as a layer back to the next layer up in the stack. Now, most software that you're going to encounter that wants to use packet radio already knows how to speak to a KISS device or an AGWPE device. So like WinLink, for example, already knows how to talk to a KISS device, already knows how to talk to an AGWPE device. So you don't have to have the actual AX25 routing part of the TNC. You can evade that with your application that already knows how to speak to those devices. Any APRS software that you're going to be running also already knows how to speak to those protocols. So why do I want a real TNC? Why would I need one? Why can't I just use this KISS protocol or whatever? The TNC, in addition to handling both the physical connection and that kind of AX25 layer, it actually implements the node. The TNC is the node. Okay. So yeah, you need the computer or the terminal to talk to the TNC to be able to present the information digitally to you as an operator, but the node is actually doing the work. So technically, with a TNC and a radio and a computer, you can turn the computer off. As long as your TNC is running, your node is up. Your TNC and your radio is on, your node is up. It's doing things, right? So it's able to receive information, it's able to send information, it's able to act as a node on the network. Without a TNC, when you're using a soft modem, a sound modem, your computer has to implement that functionality. Okay. So some examples of TNCs, you can actually still buy a real TNC. Cantronics still makes them. There's also some out there that are old that are for sale. You'll come across them at ham fests. You'll come across them at swap meets. People will be like, oh, I have this box of junk under my desk. They'll take it to the ham fest and stick it on a table somewhere. And as you paw through that, you'll find, 16 cables and a little box that says Cantronics on it. And you'll say, hey, what do you want for this? And they'll say, I don't know, 50 bucks. And you can either say, okay, or screw you. But you'll find them. They're out there. Cantronics actually still makes them. They're still making the KPC3 and some other versions that they have. MFJ used to make one called the 1270C. They no longer make that. They now only make one that is the 1270X, which only supports KISS and AGWPE protocols, doesn't do a full TNC. So remember, we talked about the difference there. These KISS TNCs, there's a bunch of these out there too, right? TNCX and its derivatives. The MFJ one is actually based on TNCX. There's the Mobile Link D TNC, which I think I've brought mine in before and shown it. It's a little box about this big, and it has a connection that plugs into my radio, and then it presents a Bluetooth serial port. And I can use software on my phone or on my computer to connect to that and do things in that route. Only implements KISS, doesn't implement the full TNC. And there's also this TNC 9K6, which is actually a project you can buy for about probably about $12. Comes with a board and a microcontroller, and then there's a list of other parts that you can order from DigiKey. Altogether, it costs you about $28 to get it, put it together, right? You solder it together yourself, and it acts as a KISS TNC, right? Matt in the West Valley Radio Club, he actually sells a module that is a TNC 9K6 on a what they call a hat for a Raspberry Pi. So it's a little board, and if you got a Raspberry Pi, which is a single board computer, you plug this board on top of the Raspberry Pi, and now you've got the node, got the computer, that's the Raspberry Pi, you got the TNC, that's the 9K6 guy. Plug that into your radio and off you go. Dan's got one. Dan's got one. He loves it. I've got one. I haven't actually used it yet.
And you get to put it together, so you can get it in kit form.
You can get it in kit form, right? Yeah. Does he have them still?
Yeah.
Because with the chip shortage, a lot of things have been hard to get. So for example, the Moby Link D, can't get it right now. I was talking with the guy who manufactures it, and he's actually coming out. So the one I have is a what they call a TNC2. It's the second version of the Mobile Link D. There's also the TNC3, which if you want to use it with like an Apple iPad or an iPhone, you have to get the 3 because that's the only one that implements the particular Bluetooth protocol that the Apple iOS understands. He's actually coming out with a version 4 that is essentially identical to the 3, but uses a different set of chips that he can actually still get. So he doesn't have that on the website yet, but it's going to be coming out pretty soon. And I know at one point Matt was having trouble getting the microcontroller part for his, but if he's got those available now, then he can start making them again. So I don't know. I think when I bought the Mobile Link D, I think it was about $70, $60. And it came with the cable, came with one cable to go from the Mobile Link D to the radio. But you could order additional cables for like $10 each or something like that. The 9K6 from Matt, I want to say it was about $40 assembled, but you could buy it in kit form for like $20 less or something like that.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there. So not super expensive, right? I mean, none of this stuff was crazy expensive. And getting a Raspberry Pi right now is probably the hardest part of using something like that. Yeah, in fact, it took me 6 months to get my Raspberry Pi. And at one point, DigiKey said, we think we'll ship it to you in 2099. So then like 3 weeks later, it showed up in the mailbox. But yeah, so they're scarce. You haven't tried recently. Yeah, they're hard to come by right now for whatever reason. They keep saying it's the chip shortage, but they keep popping up. There's actually a website called RPi Finder where you can go and find out who's got them in stock. And half the time it's some place in Germany or, Japan or somewhere. Finding them here in the US is harder than you would think. I went with DigiKey because I could pre-order it through DigiKey and pay them. And then as soon as they could get one, they would ship it to me. And, it took a while, but I did actually get it. Okay, so let's talk about the radio side. Now we need to hook this thing up to a radio, right? So some radios, generally not the cheapo Chinese radios, but some radios have a data port on them. Now, if Chris was here, he would say, oh, my cheapo, not so cheap Baofeng or BTEC, whatever the heck one he has, it's the quad bander. I don't remember which one it is. It has a data port on it. It's the only Chinese manufactured radio that I've seen that has a data port on it. Like the Anytones, the 5888s that we got, doesn't have a data port. Any of the TYTs or Q somethings, what are the Q?
The QYT.
QYTs, they don't have them. Yeah. None of those are going to have it. But if you can get a Yaesu or an ICOM or a Kenwood, they probably do have it. And when they'll say they have a data port, you got to keep in mind it's not really data. In some cases, we're going to talk about the difference there in a minute. But essentially, what it is it's the port that provides you access to the audio signal through a plugged connection rather than through the microphone and the speaker, right? And so, of course, the wonderful thing about standards is there are so many of them to choose from, right? So there are standards for what these ports look like. Here's a picture of a typical port. It's basically what they call a DIN connector, which is this round kind of connector. If you've ever worked with Apple Talk, it uses a connector very similar to this. I've also seen these with 8 ports, 8 pins on them. I've seen them with 10 pins on them. It just depends on the radio manufacturer. But this is a fairly typical one of the 6 pins. One pin is where it says here in the diagram, data in. That's kind of a misnomer. It really means the audio in, right? Then there's the ground pin, which is common for all of the signals. There's the PTT input, which again, we talked about how the computer could key up the radio by asserting this PTT pin. I don't know what they're talking about with this FSK in. That doesn't make any sense to me, but there's also this data out, which is really an audio out port. And then there's a squelch out, which is that signal that I talked about that says the radio is saying, oh, I'm receiving a signal now, right? Most of your interfaces aren't going to care about that squelch pin. And some of them, like the Kenwoods, are actually going to have 2 audio out pins on there. One for 1200 baud and one for 9600 baud. So that's something to pay attention to as well. And, we can talk about that a bit. But the key factor is that audio signal is before the discriminator. So the squelch doesn't apply on that connector. So where normally you adjust your squelch so that you're not hearing all the noise, the computer's hearing all the noise all the time, or the sound card's hearing all the noise all the time. It's able to discern the actual signal when there is a signal and separate that out from the noise. But my radio doesn't have a nifty data port. What do I do? Well, you can plug into the mic and speaker ports on the radio. And this is what I do on my Anytone, right? I plug into the microphone port. I have a little cable that plugs into the microphone port and has the PTT signal for that and the mic audio signal. And then I have a cable that plugs into the speaker port that plugs into my signal link that allows the audio to come back. Well, if you're doing that, you want to set the radio to have the squelch open all the time because you don't want to depend on the squelch detection unsquelching. If you do that, you might miss the beginning of the transmission. So you want to leave the squelch open. So that's something you would set. You want to adjust the volume on the radio so that the audio reaching the TNC or the sound card is at the right level. And you want to adjust the mic gain on the radio potentially, or adjust the volume on the computer side or the sound card side, or the signaling side, or whatever device you're using, to not overdrive the radio through that mic port, right? So hopefully your radio has a good manual that says which pins are which in the microphone connector and which pins are which in the speaker connector and things like that, and tells you how to turn the squelch off. When I was fooling around, I was doing that presentation here where we were doing WinLink, and I was using my little handheld, and it wasn't being able to connect. And it was because I hadn't turned the squelch off. And I had to go look up the manual to figure out how to turn the squelch off on that radio, which is really annoying. There should have been a button that says squelch, but there wasn't. So anyway,
It's never that
it's never that easy,
easy.
right? On your Baofengs, it's going to be like a menu setting that you have to find, and then you can adjust it to be all the way off. On my Kenwood, I had to hit the function key, and then I think it was the monitor key. So I'm essentially telling it, open the monitor all the time, and that basically turned the squelch off. But yeah, it was annoying. There are also some radios out there that have integrated TNCs. So the TNC is actually built into the radio. Kenwood has these. As far as I'm aware, only Kenwood has ever had these. The Kenwood handhelds, the THD7, I know Ragnar's got one of those. The D72 that I have, the D74 that Dave and Neil have, those all have a TNC built into them. On the mobiles, the D700 and the D710 have a TNC built into them. Now, they also have APRS functionality. We'll talk about that later. But the TNC is built right in the radio, and it's actually a full TNC. Like, it can act in connected mode. It can do things. You can connect to it with a computer and type commands at it, and it will execute those commands and do everything that a real TNC, a real hardware TNC will do. So that's kind of cool. I have seen issues where the buffering in the radio isn't enough in certain cases. Like the D700, I know has trouble working with the AX25 stack on Linux machines because it doesn't have a big enough buffer, but there are things you can do in your configurations to make it work pretty well. So it's pretty cool, pretty slick. Yaesu radios that have APRS built in, they have a TNC in there, but you can't access it. They don't give you access to that from outside of the radio, which is really annoying. So if you want to do this, you got to look for a Kenwood radio if you want a hardware TNC built into the radio. Okay, so APRS, what's that? APRS is the Automatic Packet Reporting System. It was developed by Bob Berninga, WB4 APR, who passed away in February. APRS basically uses the AX25 framing and packet mechanisms that Packet Radio is using, but it kind of cheats and violates the protocol and does weird things because the way APRS works, it's not connection oriented. And so the APRS kind of fakes that out, and it uses special codes for the destination station in the AX25. We've talked about APRS before. We talked about it back in May of 2020. We're going to talk about it some more on January 12th. I've got another class coming up where we're going to talk about what can I do with APRS, what can't I do with APRS, and things like that. But yeah.
Got a question on that.
Yeah,
Like in APRS, you can send messages.
you can.
So what's the difference between?
So the difference is that that message sending is happening at a higher layer. Okay. So in packet radio, I can connect to my TNC and I can say, TNC, I want you to connect to, WV7 or K7 WVC, which is the West Valley City's node. And it will set up a connection to that node. And then once I'm connected to that node, I can type things that will show up at that node and it can send things back to me, right? With APRS, I can send in the message. I want to send a message to N7LCR and my message is blah. And then that gets sent out and everybody gets it. But only your radio cares that it got it and tells you that it got it, right? And same thing when you reply, everybody sees that, but only my only my radio cares to show me. If I'm some voyeur out listening, I can see all the message traffic on APRS. If I'm doing connected mode, technically I can do that too. I can still see everything because I can hear it, right? If I can hear it, I can see it. But there is this concept of this connection between the two machines. And again, if it has to route from machine to machine to get there, it'll do that with this connected mode that packet radio uses. APRS kind of depends on this kind of flood fill algorithm, right? So if you look at APRS and you see, there's the wide 2-2 parameter, and what that's basically saying is I want to be digipeated twice. So if I send a packet out, some digipeater somewhere will hear it, will decrement that number and send it out again. And some other digipeater might hear it and send it out again. And then it stops. So it floods a local area, basically. Whereas with packet radio, I'm going to say specifically, I want to send a message to this node over here. And to get there, I'm going to go through this node, and then I'm going to get there. And so I send it, this node receives it, it sends it, that node receives it, it sends it, that destination node receives it, regardless of how many hops there are or whatever.
I remember when I first set it up, do some aircraft stuff. I had the normal setup, whatever it was, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1. In aircraft, you just do 1. Because everybody hears it.
You're high enough, right?
I mean,
Yeah,
you can cover half state.
right.
Real easy.
Yeah.
You know?
So probably the takeaway, Ragnar, is everybody can see the pictures you're sending, so I would stop sending. I'm just saying.
And everyone's done that. Oh my God.
Nobody wants to see Ragnar's codpiece, right? Too late now, is that what you said? Oh, yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk more about APRS later, but in another class. But so what can we do with packet? Remember, packet radio is a mechanism for moving data via RF, right? So anything I can do with digital data, I can do with packet radio. I can do chat, which is where like I type and you read what I'm typing, you type and I see what you're typing. I can do email, I can send messages. A TNC can actually hold on to messages for you. It can actually act as a mailbox. So if I send a message to Dave and his TNC is on, but his computer is off, that message will sit on the TNC and wait for him until he connects to the TNC next time and he can see his message. It's sitting at his station, but doesn't need to go to this computer. Bulletin board systems are fairly popular, or at least they were popular in the 80s. I don't know how popular they are now. You can do NTS message passing. And if you remember, we had a class on NTS, that's the National Traffic System. Thanks. That's basically the mechanism that is used to send messages, official messages from place to place over ham radio, right? Well, that can be done over packet radio. There's also special applications that people use on packet radio to do things. Dan participated in the Wasatch 100, right? Wasn't that the one where you were using it? And they used packet radio to keep track of runners as they come in and out of aid stations. And so a radio operator sitting at each aid station would be given an information that runner 4:25 showed up at such and such a time. You enter that and it gets sent to the packet radio server, and that gets stored in a database. And there was an application that ran on a machine somewhere that tracked all of that information. And that way they knew, the people running the race knew where the runners were on the course.
And
If anybody disappeared, they knew about that, right? Oh my gosh, it's been 6 hours. It shouldn't take 6 hours to run from aid station 3 to aid station 4. We probably better go look for them, right? Dan, can you tell us more about how that worked and how well it worked for you guys?
Oh my, so I'm usually in aid station 13, the last aid station before the home finish line. And by the time the runners get to me, they are toast, right? Because they've run 93, 94 miles. And so, okay, so I have my packet radio. I actually use 2 radios. One I dedicate for the packets. I use a FTM 100. And I have it hooked up to a signal link and hooked up to the computer. And it's just we use like a putty type of terminal to talk to the main database, and it's all through we transmit, and it's constantly receiving. Matter of fact, if you want to test your battery system and your flow kit, run packet overnight, right? Because it is constantly receiving, constantly transmitting, just for the updates and whatnot. But it's really cool because I can get anybody to come in and say, hey, can you tell me where runner 325 is? And all I got to do is just query the database 325, and I can say it left station 12 at such and such a time, and it should be here. And if this person does not show up by such and such a time, then the system keeps track of it and puts a little flag saying,
This runner's late.
you better check this one. It runs really efficiently. It keeps, the only time we have to talk is if there's any issues, and just some basic PM stuff. But it runs very slick, and for the last 4 Wasatch 100s I've been there, and it runs really, really well. That signaling just works like a charm.
Does exactly what you want, right?
And I could sit home
And watch it,
and watch what.
right?
Yeah.
And track basically the runners as they proceed through the course. For example, you could, the way that database was set up, you could query a particular runner and watch them as they leave an aid station and enter an aid station and so on throughout the entire course. So pretty cool.
When I first started, the pack was quite interesting to get going. This was like 35 years ago.
Yeah, it's well honed nowadays.
Yeah.
And this is where we enter in all the DNFs that did not finish, any injuries, everything is done on the packet radio, and it just works great.
And the advantage of that too is because this is a digital mechanism with error correction and everything that goes along with that. If so say you're talking on the radio and you're saying runner 375 is needing a pickup or whatever, right? That's great. But what if they heard 395 or something like that, or 379? And so they think the wrong runner is being picked up. And that stuff hopefully gets sorted out in the wash at the end of the race. But because it's digital and you've typed it in, and you can look at what you're typing before you hit enter and make sure you typed it in correctly, that data is much more valid than having to go on audio.
And it's only as good as a person doing the data.
That's true.
And
That's
so
true.
Sometimes,
You might miss somebody, somebody might run right by and you didn't get them, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that can happen.
Yeah.
But
Well, especially at the start, like I've done France Peak.
yeah, when there's 100 people
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, there they go,
In 15 minutes, got 100 people. not like yours, they're spaced out for hours.
On 13 it is, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Although you get chunks of people every once in a while that run together, right? And, but the interesting, well, let's see. Yeah, it's just a lot of fun. I was gonna say, there's a lot of different things that happen. It's not the same old. It's like what I do for a living. I implement network management solutions, so I deal with SNMP all day long. And it's the same huge piece of software that I install in hundreds of companies, and every single network that I install this one, it's like it's a brand new system. It is different, nothing is the same. The software is the same, but that's the only common link. It's how it's implemented. It's completely different, and that's why working the Wasatch 100, the Salt Flats 100, all of those events, you do the same thing every year, but it's not the same thing. Every year there's something different, and which is really, really fun.
So that's another example of something that can be run essentially on top of this packet radio network. So once this network is up and running and in place, you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. Another thing that you'll see or used to see on Packet, I don't know if you still see these on Packet, are DX cluster reports. So we've talked about DXing before. That's like making long distance radio contacts on HF, right? And what a DX cluster is when somebody pops up on the radio from a let's call it a more rare station than is typical, right? And so everybody wants to make a contact with them because, oh my gosh, there's a guy on Christmas Island, for Christ's sake. I've never heard anybody from Christmas Island before. I want to get him. So there's a pileup on there. And people will report, I heard this guy on XYZ frequency and he's here. And they'll send this information into a DX cluster. And everybody's sitting there watching on their connection, sees this message pop out, and bam, everybody's diving for this guy, right?
well, it's even more like when they're reporting, you're like, they're up 20.
Yeah, yeah, which is very helpful to know that, right?
They're listening on one frequency, but they're transmitting
Up 20, right?
So you can tune in the right frequency that they're listening and talk on that one.
Yeah. So DX clusters are something that used to be super popular on packet radio. I don't know if they're still popular or not, but they definitely used to be. Then, of course, any other protocols you want to run on top of AX25 that you choose to, right? So you can basically run anything that uses data on that connection. I ran out of time while I was preparing this presentation, and so that's where I stopped. But there's a ton more that we can talk about with packet radio, and there are some things we've got about 15, well, we got about 10 minutes left. What I can do is pull up some other stuff here that will maybe help people. Let me actually make this full screen, but this is a page called soundcardpacket.org, and he talks about some things you can do with packet radio. There's a whole organization called TAPR, TAPR, and it's all around packet radio or data and radio stuff. Let's see, tapper.org. Tomorrow's ham radio technology today, keeping in mind that for them, tomorrow was 40 years ago. But there's all kinds of stuff on here about, they do a conference every year. They do, all the information from the conference, all the talks, the papers are all logged on their site. There's tons of stuff. They run a bunch of mailing lists as well. If you're interested in getting involved in packet radio, there's a lot of good information on their site. Yeah.
Another good source to get a lot of packet radio information is in the Salt Lake County Areas flash drive that we give everybody. There's a huge section in the packet radio there, and it has the configs and everything on so many radios, ECU, ICOM, Alfane, you name it, it's there. So,
Um,
And that's really important because there's a lot of things you need to configure correctly, you know, and it's good to work with somebody, you know, or several people, actually.
so
For your signaling, presentation, it got me a digi-rig.
did you like it?
Tried it without them trying to do it.
You haven't succeeded yet?
It's a sound mode, but I'm not succeeding it.
Huh.
So I threw the rig in. One day I'll.
Chris and I beat on his configuration for like 2 days before we figured out what we were missing. I cannot remember what it was, but let's figure out a time when I can either come over or you can drag your stuff over here or whatever.
Well, it's a small kid, right?
So
You're not doing extra, it's just a radio.
if you want to bring it next week to the dinner, maybe we can take a few minutes and poke around at it, see what we can figure out. But I know it was something really simple and stupid that once we realized what it was like, oh, we beat on this for like hours. And then we finally figured it out, and it was
We all printed out. configuration we had on the setup. And then we all brought that together and compared notes. And it seemed like you're right, man. There's one or two little things that are different, and it's, why didn't I see that, you know? It's one of those kind of, sure, that's probably what it is.
so this page here is packetradiomap.com, and they basically are tracking any nodes that are using what they call NetROM, which is a packet radio node implementation. And you can see this is zoomed in on Salt Lake, and let me just zoom in a little bit more so you can see there's a few nodes. There's not a lot here in Salt Lake. I would love to see more nodes popping up on here. But like here's the West Valley's node out here. And if you click on this, theoretically it will pop. Oh, it's popped up over here. K2 WBC. And it last checked in on November 23rd. So I don't know if it's even still alive or not. There's this guy here, KE7BME. Says he's right in the middle of Murray. I don't know why he's not here. So if anybody knows who this is, let's introduce him to the club. But there's, if you look at this, we'll pull this back, and you can see like there's just a little island of packet here in the Salt Lake and Utah Valley area. There's a lot going on in Denver. There's a lot going on in LA. And then if you look over here on the East Coast, there's a ton of packet going on over here. And I did find a Rat Pack presentation on packet in the 21st century. Do not watch this. It is not good unless you're really motivated. As you can see, I've made it 52 minutes into it, and that's where I stopped. This guy is a very smart guy, I'm sure, but I had a really hard time listening to him and getting the information that he was putting out. But one thing that he
Well, that's what I promote.
sorry, one thing that he did, let me put that back. One thing that he did talk about was in Delaware, which is where he is, they have been building out this Delaware packet network, and they are trying to, what they're trying to do is get more people using packet in Delaware. So let's see if we can find some information about this while we're here. EEPN.
When would you say the packet activity was? How many years ago?
Probably the late 80s, I would say. So the internet really started picking up in the early 90s, right? And that was what kind of was the the death knell for Packet. And I don't want to call it the death knell really, because Packet hasn't ever gone away. But Packet was super, super popular before this. But yeah, probably late 80s, early 90s. Let's see if we can find, oh, here we go, depn.net. And they actually have a map of Packet stations in Delaware, and looks like the surrounding area as well. Obviously, they have some work to do to get more stations live in here. But one of their goals is to get some nodes up and doing things. There's a software package called BPQ, which basically implements this kind of node setup on top of the sound modem. So it does the things that a TNC would do for you. It also has additional features on top of that. It's kind of similar to this NetROM system. There's a Linux version of BPQ that runs on the Raspberry Pi. I haven't done anything with it yet. I'll probably do another class later after I have time to play with it, figure out how it all works. But there's a lot of information. If you just search for Packet Radio, there's tons of stuff out there. And I think it's a cool utilization of the technology, and it's something that given our desire to communicate, particularly in an emergency situation, being able to have a solid error corrected channel to get data from place to place just feels like something that would be super valuable for us as a club. I would like us to run a Packet station similar to West Valley City's node, ideally on our tower, which we would need a radio, a computer, and a sound card interface, and the appropriate software. Could be a Raspberry Pi with one of Matt's 9K6 units attached to it, hooked up to a radio and an antenna on the tower. And that would cover the entire Salt Lake Valley easily. I think that would be a great use of some of that space in the shack over there. But that's basically all I've got for you guys for tonight, and we're pretty close. We're right at 8 o'clock. Perfect timing. So
If anybody, didn't make it to the whole map.
I talked to him about 4 months ago. I haven't talked to him since. So
I'm wondering if this signals like necessary for our up front.
I would love to have him talk to us about that. Any other questions, comments, things of that sort? All right. I'm going to kill the recording and